Hey there, welcome to the Algebra 2 video that I'm about to do on the January 2024 exam. So it is currently June 2024, June 13th, so this is the most recent Algebra 2 exam that we have. So buckle up, we are going to go for a ride here. Alright, starting with our first question, a nice little stats question. Cafeteria food manager studied the lunchtime eating habits of a group of employees in their office building. The purpose of the study was to determine the proportion of employees who purchased lunch in the cafeteria, brought their lunch from home, or purchased lunch from an outside vendor. This collection of data would best be classified as observational study. You're just collecting data from people. You're not doing anything to influence their eating habits, so option 3. Which graph is imaginary? My first thought when I see that is imaginary roots mean it is not crossing the x-axis, so therefore it must be option 2. Given 3 is a root, what are the other unique roots of f of x? Alright, so the first thing I'm noticing is that if I know 3 is a root, that means x minus 3 is a factor. So I can use synthetic division to break down this polynomial. Keep in mind there is a missing constant term in there that I'll have to take into account. Alright, so here we go. Notice I put 3 in the upper right because that's the root of x minus 3. Alright, so that means this is x cubed plus 2x squared minus 15x. Okay, so now I see a GCF of x. And then some AM factoring. Alright, now it's looking for roots. So I set this equal to 0 and solve. So it looks like my roots are 0, -5, and 3. Now in this problem, we're looking for the other unique roots. So in this problem, I actually almost fell in this trap. Do you guys see how -3 is listed here? Yeah, careful. This is a positive 3. Now, positive 3 actually already existed, so that means that root's occurring twice. Now, the other unique roots would then be -5 and 0, so the correct option is 2. Now, something else you guys could do is type this in your calculator and look at where it crosses the x-axis, so I'll show what that looks like. Alright, so I typed it in, I adjusted it a little bit, but what you guys are seeing is intercepts at -5, 0, and 3, and there's that kiss at 3, which is why there's a multiplicity of 2, and that's why these are your other 2 unique roots. Alright, moving on to question 4. Given p of x is not equal to q, so it just means that they're not the same, express this as a log function. Alright, so I'm just going to write this off to the side. P equals 1/2 to the q. I'm just going to write down log, and then I'm thinking BAP, base answer power. So base, the answer is P from here, equals power, which is q, and so therefore my correct answer is 3. So again, we're just thinking BAP there. Base stays in the basement, that's why the 1/2 is the base of the log, as it's the base of the exponent. Alright, question 2, which graph represents the graph of f of x where a and b are positive real numbers? Alright, so I look at this and I'm like, alright, well, if x plus a is a root, that means -a is a root with a multiplicity of 2, which means there's a kiss at the x-axis there. X equals b is there with a multiplicity of 1, which means there is a cross. Something else to pay attention to is that this is an x squared times an x, which means it's a degree 3 polynomial. Leading coefficient here is positive because there's no negative listed, so if we have a positive leading coefficient and it's an odd degree, odd is opposite, positive means it ends positively, so right there that's my end behavior. Okay, so from that I can eliminate options 3 and 4. So now I'm looking at 1 and 2. Well, 2 has no kisses, 1 does. And 1 makes sense to have a kiss at negative a, so a negative value, and a cross at a positive b value. Option 1. All right, the equations y equals 3t plus 6 and y equals 1.182t approximately model 2 separate growth populations where t is greater than 0. What is the approximate time t at which the populations are the same? So this is just a calculator problem ultimately, guys. You're going to type this into y1 and this into y2 and find where they intersect. So I'm going to pull up my calculator and do that as well. Alright, so just so you guys see, I did type in y1 and y2, and I took a peek at my standard window, so zoom 6'd it, and I see 1 intersection, but I'm missing 1 up here. You could look at your table of values to get an idea of what's happening. So at x equals 10, you guys can see that we are already up to like 398. I probably don't even have to go that high, but you can kind of get a gauge of how it's very quickly, well, exponentially growing from here. So I could go to, let me just put in like 100 just to show you guys what it would look like. Okay, there's my line. And there's my exponential function. Okay, now something to consider here, guys, is that we're talking about exponential growth over time, and time can't be negative. In fact, they emphasized it here, so I'm already eliminating option 1. Like, that's not possible. Now, you can now go here, go to your calculator, second trace, option 5. It's going to ask me if I'm on the first curve, which I am on my y1. It jumped to y2. Now, as far as the guess goes, I'm just going to move the cursor closer to the one I want to find. And, oh, hey, look at that. Correct answer is 5.11 as far as time t, because that represented x. The y value was 21.3, so be careful not to pick that one. That's a distractor answer. So what's the approximate time t? Correct answer is 5.1. All right, question 7, given the y equals negative 2x and x squared plus y squared equals 5. Find the intersection in quadrant 2. All right, now, first of all, guys, this is a circle centered at the origin with a radius of radical 5. You're not going to graph that easily in your calculator, so I'm taking an algebraic approach. I can substitute negative 2x in. And do a little math here. So this would be 4x squared plus 1x squared, which is 5x squared. So x squared equals 1. But be careful, because technically you get 2 solutions plus or minus 1. Now, here is where a lot of students will get tripped up. Well, first of all, they'll forget the plus or minus. But this specifically wants to be in quadrant 2. So quadrant 2 would mean x would have to be negative. So I'm looking at x equals negative 1. If I know y equals negative 2x, my y value is positive 2, so you're looking for the coordinate negative 1, 2, which is option 4. Question 8 is ultimately a synthetic division problem, and always check for missing terms. I am seeing that there is a 0x cubed missing. So let me actually move some of this to give myself some room here. I can shrink. Okay, cool. All right, so here we go. Dividing with a root of 3. All right, so that remainder of 124 thankfully only comes up one place, and it would be their third degree to start. So option 2. All right, next, a parabola question where you get a focus at negative 3, 2, and a directrix at y equals 0. Okay, I'm going to sketch a picture. 1, 2, 3, 1, 2. So here's my focus. Okay, now maybe I'll switch up my colors here. Okay, y equals 0 is a horizontal line, which is ultimately right on your x-axis. Now, what you have to remember is that if this is the focus and this is the directrix, the vertex would be smack dab in the middle. Now, the parabola hugs the focus, so it looks like that. Now, with that being said, if your focus is at -3, 2 and you're smack dab in the middle here, that means the vertex must be at -3, 1. So right there you can eliminate some options. So therefore I would have to have it be x plus 3. So I'm eliminating options 4 and 2. From there it comes down to, what's the p-value? Well, the p-value is this distance right here, or right here technically, which is 1 unit, and it's 1 over 4p, so therefore the correct option is option 1. All right, question 10. Find the 7th term of the geometric sequence. So first thing I would do is figure out my common ratio. So I'm just going to take 2 terms and divide them. 2 consecutive terms, I should say. Now I'm going to do some rationalizing to clean this up a little bit. That's 1/3, or -1/3 I should say, and this breaks up into radical 9 and radical 2. Which is -3 radical 2 over 3, or negative radical 2. Okay, so if that's my common ratio, now I'm thinking an explicit formula would help me spit out whatever value I need. So therefore, a sub n equals a sub 1 times r to the n minus 1, and that's something you guys can look up on your reference sheet. And therefore, this would be the corresponding formula that makes sense for this particular sequence. Now, remember, they want the 7th term, so I'm plugging in 7 for n. So this is the square root of 6 times negative radical 2 to the 6th. Now, at this point, you could grab your calculator if you didn't feel comfortable doing this. If I take a negative radical 2 and I raise him to the 6th power, that gives me 8. So that means this whole thing simplifies to 8 radical 6, which means that's my 7th term, which means the correct option is 3. All right, question 11 is ultimately a middle 95% problem. Middle 95% means that we are doing the mean plus or minus 2 times the standard deviation. So company is looking at cooking time for spaghetti. We see that this process is repeated 35 times, blah, blah, blah. It's normally distributed with a mean of 9.82 minutes and a standard deviation of 1.4. So I'm doing mean plus or minus 2 times the standard deviation. So 9.82 plus or minus 2 times 1.4. And ultimately from there, guys, you're just going to your calculator. 9.82 plus 2 times 1.4, and then vice versa with the minus. You guys would end up with option 2. Question 12, a little division problem. But I'm noticing that it's probably going to be something like a factor and cancel based on the way that my final answers are even listed. So let's write it as the way it has described in function notation. So 2x squared plus 7x minus 15 all over 3 minus 2x. Now, honestly, if I had to guess a factor in the numerator just based on looking at my options, I would probably think that this top part factors to 2x minus 3. But let's play the game. You don't notice that. Ultimately, that's some triangle factoring. So factors of negative 30 that sum to 7. So 2x squared. So factors of negative 30 that sum to 7 would be negative 3 and 10. Factor out of GCF. GCF again. Oh, hey, look at that. Just as I predicted, there's that factor I anticipated, just based on looking at the problem. So that means this is equivalent to 2x minus 3 times x plus 5 divided by 3 minus 2x. Now the purpose of this problem is to get you to factor and cancel and recognize that you have opposite factors, so therefore you're going to get a negative. So with that being said, the negative distributes to the x plus 5, so you would get negative x minus 5, which is option 1. All right, which equation is equivalent? So this is a power over root problem ultimately. Let me zoom in here because it's a little bit tight. Okay, so power over root means I can rewrite this as 210 cube root of x to the 4th times the cube root of y to the 7th. Now, if you look at your options, that's not any of them because they took it further. So I'm thinking to myself, I can rewrite this as the cube root of x cubed times the cube root of x to the 1st, because that would allow me to break that down appropriately. And same thing with the y to the 7th. That would be the y to the 6th, because that's divisible by 3, but then I'd have a leftover y to the 1st. All right, so cube root of x cubed is x. Cube root of y to the 6th is y squared, because I'm just dividing by 3. So I have 210 xy squared, but then don't forget you had that leftover cube root of x times the cube root of y, which is the same thing as the cube root of xy, which is option 3. All right, question 14. This one's super fun. All right, so the average cost of a gallon of milk in the United States between the years of 1995 and 2018 can be modeled by the equation P of T, where P of T represents the cost in dollars and time is T years since 1995. During this period of time, in what year did it reach its maximum? Okay, so upon first glance, you're like, okay, cool. So I'm just typing this in the calculator and finding the maximum. So let me grab my calculator. All right, so paused it, typed it in. Here we go. If I do a zoom 6 for a standard window, you're going to see it start to dip down and then go back up. Now, what I did to help me figure out the window I wanted to look at was I looked at my year options and I thought to myself, well, 2018 is 23 years since 1995, because that's the beginning of this function. So with that being said, I kind of rounded up to 25, let's say. And so my x max is, I'm going to adjust to 25. Hit graph. So there is a maximum, it's just ever so slight. So if I go second trace maximum, which is option 4, okay, this cursor's to the left, so I can hit enter. And then I can either toggle my cursor to the right, or I actually can just type in 25 because I know that's the furthest value to the right anyway. And that's going to give me my right bound. So if I hit enter, there it is. So there's my maximum at 18.31 as far as time goes, right? Because time is x values. Now remember, this was years since 1995. So if I add 1995 to that number, that would give me like 2013.317. Now, look at your options. A lot of people are going to want to pick 2014, but it's in what year? So this is still in the year 2013 because 2013.0 would technically be like January 1st. So this is sometime in the first half of the year. So therefore, the correct option is 2. So it's a fun calculator one because even just look at the function itself, lots of decimals and stuff. And then you have to find the right window, and then you got to find the maximum, and then you have to interpret it correctly, and they make 2 really close options. So make sure you pick the right one. All right, next, this question is asking about putting a roast in the oven. We have our little function f here for the temperature in degrees Fahrenheit. What was the temperature of the roast when it was first put into the oven? So when you put the roast in the oven, that means no time has passed yet. So I'm just plugging in t equals 0 to this function. So 325 minus 185e to the negative 0.4 times 0. Now, anything to the 0 power is 1. So ultimately, this just becomes 325 minus 185 times 1, which is 140, which is why that's option 4. Okay, next, what's the roots of the equation in a plus bi form? You guys can do quadratic formula, but it's actually faster just to do completing the square here. So I would have x squared plus 6x plus blank equals negative 10 plus blank. If you want to draw a cutesy little box, that's fine too. Half of 6 is 3, squared is 9. So that's my magic number there. And by AM factoring, this factors to x plus 3 squared, as these numbers will always match. 9 plus negative 10 is negative 1, and now we're clear to take the square root. Square root of negative 1 is I, don't forget your plus or minus. So x equals negative 3 plus or minus I, which is option 3. All right, question 17, which is not an identity, so make sure you read that carefully. Okay, well, the first one is dots, so that's good, that's true. Second one's just exponent rules because, yeah, that's the same thing being written twice. So that checks out. So now you're between 3 and 4. 3, some of you may be able just to look at this and know, but if you actually FOIL this out, it does check out because this is 2xy. So by process of elimination, it is option 4. Right, 18, 2 surveys were conducted to estimate the proportion of teens who use social media at least once per day. We have 100 samples of 5 teens and 100 samples of 50 teens. So 5 teens versus 50 teens. Same number of samples. First thing I've noticed is sample size is increasing. Based on the results of the survey, it was determined that approximately 75% of teens use social media at least once per day. What is the best explanation of the difference in the results between the 2 surveys? Well, if you kind of scan the options, they're talking about sample size. So we know that as sample size increases, standard deviation decreases. And margin of error is also something they're talking about in these problems. And margin of error is 2 times the standard deviation. So in essence, your margin of error is also decreasing. So the correct option is 3. The larger the sample size resulted in a smaller margin of error and should provide a more accurate estimate. All right, moving on to question 19. Given f of x and f inverse of x, find the value of b. Okay, so first thing I'm noticing is that if they're giving me f of x and f inverse, they probably want me then to find the inverse of this. So I'm going to switch x and y. And I'm going to solve for y. Okay, so at this point, I can see that the inverse is equal to the cube root of x plus 3. Now, remember, they told you the inverse is equal to that. So I'm going to do a little substitution. All right, so therefore, I can drop the cube roots. I can drop the x's. It must be true that negative 3b equals 3. So therefore, b must equal negative 1. So that was a kind of interesting one. All right, the next one. All right, this one, there's a lot to pay attention to in this. Robert is buying a car that costs $22,000. After a down payment of $4,000, he borrows the remainder from the bank, a 6-year loan at 6.24% annual interest rate. The following formula can be used to calculate his monthly loan payment. Okay, and ultimately it wants me to find Robert's monthly payment. So what that tells me is that this is my unknown, therefore I should be able to figure out everything else listed here in this problem. Now the first is the loan amount. Now he had $22,000, but he's doing a down payment of $4,000. So $22,000 subtracting $4,000 leaves me with $18,000. So that's the size of his loan. So I have that off to the side. Now monthly interest rate, they gave you an annual interest rate. Now, as a decimal, the annual interest rate is 0.0624, but if we're talking monthly, I have to divide that by 12, which is 0.0052. Now, lastly, our time t, but notice how t is in months. So this was a 6-year loan, so times 12 is, shoot, what is 6 times 12? I'm like blanking here for a second. 6 times 12, oh my god, 72, isn't it? Yep, there was my blank. All right, so 72 is going to be my time t. All right, so ultimately, guys, that's just what you're plugging in. 18000, 1 point, oops, sorry, not 1 point, ignore that. 0.0052. Just plugging into my formula. 1 minus 1 plus 0.0052 to the negative 72. Now, I'm going to skip typing it in my calculator. I think you guys can do that from there. Just use alpha y equals to get that fraction, and ultimately it works out to option 2. All right, question 21. Tangent of theta is negative 4/3, where theta is between pi over 2 and pi, which is the same thing as 90 degrees and 180, aka quadrant 2. Find the value of secant of theta. Okay, so first thing I'm thinking is let's draw a picture. We have a triangle in quadrant 2 because that's where they told me theta terminated. Tangent is an opposite over an adjacent, so opposite side is 4, adjacent is 3. Technically negative 3 if you're going in the negative direction. And secant is the reciprocal of cosine, which is an adjacent over a hypotenuse. Ultimately, I need the hypotenuse. So if I do a quick little Pythagorean theorem, that is 9 plus 16, which is 25. So x is 5. This is also known as a 3, 4, 5 right triangle, aka a Pythagorean triple. So if I want to find cosine of theta, that would be adjacent over hypotenuse, which would be 3 over 5, which means that secant of theta would be 5 over 3. But hold up. You got to make sure you check your ASTC chart. ASTC. In quadrant 2, only sine and cosecant, his reciprocal, would be positive. Therefore, secant is negative, which is why our answer is negative 5/3. Option 1. Question 2. To solve the equation, Joan's first step was to multiply both sides by least common denominator. Which statement is true? Now, this question is all about extraneous solutions, so ultimately, let's solve it, see what the solutions are, and if something rejects. So what I'm noticing is my common denominator would be x plus 7, x minus 7, so I'm going to have to make some adjustments. He's going to need an x minus 7, second fraction is going to need an x plus 7, and same thing from the last one. All right, so when the problem equates, I can drop the base and solve the numerator. So I have 7 times x minus 7 plus 4x times x plus 7 equals 3x plus 7 times x plus 7. Okay, so from there, guys, I'm just doing some distribution and combining like terms to set it equal to 0. So here I go. Trying to give myself some more room here. Whee! Alright, so ultimately, factors of 98 that sum to 7 are negative 7 and 14, which means my solutions are 7 and negative 14. However, having x equals 7 is problematic because that would cause these two denominators to go to 0. So therefore, x equals 7 is an extraneous solution because it came up, but I cannot have it as a solution. For what it's worth, you also couldn't have negative 7 if it did come up as a solution, but it did not. So therefore, my correct answer is 3. 7 is an extraneous solution. All right, beginning July 1st, 2019, Michelle deposited $250 into a bank account that yields 0.15% each month. She continued to make those $250 deposits into this account on the first of each month for 3 years. Which expression represents the amount of money that was accounted for after her, or what was in her account after her last deposit was made on June 1st, 2022. Okay, so in this problem, the fact that you're continually adding money to the account means it's got to be a series question. So I'm eliminating options 1 and 2. Series, meaning geometric series, is this formula right here. Now, remember, she's putting $250 into the account each month, and her rate is 0.0015. So, and it's also growing, so therefore the rate must be 1 plus that R. Now, the difference between these two formulas is 3 versus 36. Now, if this is her account interest each month, and we're talking about the money being put in every month, that means the amount of payments would be 12 times 3 because it was over the course of 3 years. So therefore the exponent should be 36, and that's why it's option 4. All right, last multiple choice question. Study of red-tailed hawk population in a given area shows the population h of t can be represented by the function h of t, where t is the number of years since the study began. In terms of a monthly rate of growth, the population can be approximated by the function what? All right, so what I'm thinking is I'm going to take this function and rewrite him in terms of months. So this would be h of t equals 50 times 1.19. Now, if t is years, I'm going to want the outside exponent to be a 12t, because that means 12 times per year. But I can't just make outside exponents be things without having a balance, otherwise you would be changing the function. So, now that I do that, if I type in my calculator 1.19 raised to the 1/12th in my calculator, that is 1.015 raised to the 12t, which is option 1. And that's my mindful manipulation question. Ultimately, you're looking for what's mathematically equivalent to the original, because you're not changing the expression, you're just changing the way it looks for certain information. So for what it's worth, this is an increase of 1.5% per month. All right, so that concludes our multiple choice. We still have about 12 more questions to go on this exam, and we are now into the free response. Here we go. Factor completely. When you guys have 4 terms, you should be thinking factor by grouping. There is no GCF among all of them, so that's where I'm going to go next. I can pull out an x squared, pull out a -9. Oh, hey, look at that. X squared minus 9, x plus 4. But be careful, because x squared minus 9 is a difference of 2 squares. So I can factor that with my conjugate pairs. Done. Question 26, determine if x plus 4 is a factor and explain your answer. Honestly, I think the quickest way is just doing some synthetic division. 2, 10, 4, -16. Put -4 in the box because that's the root of what you're dividing by. Oops, I made a mistake here. This is a -4. There we go. And then this goes to 0. All right, so that 0 is representing the remainder. So is x plus 4 a factor? Yes. When dividing, the remainder equaled 0. Now, something else you guys could do is you technically could evaluate this function at -4. So, meaning do 2 times -4 cubed plus 10 times -4 squared, and so on and so forth. And it would spit out 0, which is the factor and remainder theorem, which is just another way that you could show that it's a factor. All right, an initial investment of $1,000 reaches its value v of t according to the model v of t equals 1,000 times 1.01 to the 4t, where t is the time in years. Determine the average rate of change to the nearest dollar per year of this investment from year 2 to year 7. As soon as you guys see average rate of change, you should be thinking slope formula. So we got t, we've got v of t, aka your x's and y's. They're telling you the interval is from 2 to 7. So ultimately, we need to figure out these values and then do the slope. Now, this is where I like to just utilize my technology to help me out. I'm going to type in 1,000 times 1.01, 1.01 raised to the 4t or 4x. And then I can go to my table of values and just look and see what those values are. So we got this like 1082 number and this 1321 number according to my table of values. So let me jot those down. All right, now average rate of change is your change in y over your change in x, which is ultimately in this problem v of 7 minus v of 2 all over 7 minus 2. Now, I'm going to skip the calculator part. I'm confident you guys can do that. Ultimately, we end up with 47.686 ... Now, nearest dollar is not the same thing as nearest cent. Cent is 2 decimal places. Nearest dollar is your nearest integer. So the correct answer is 48. So look out for those rounding directions, because when I gave this question to students in class, a lot of people rounded wrong. All right, question 8. When the following expression is written in the form y to the n, what's the value of n? Justify your answer. Now, justify just means show your work. So ultimately, what I'm noticing here is that this is the same thing as the -2/3. The negative moves it to the denominator of the fraction. The 2/3 is the power over the root. Now, when you guys have two numbers being multiplied with the same base, we would just add our exponents. So this would be -2/3 plus 4. -2/3 plus 4 is 10/3, which They said set it equal to y to the n. So therefore, n is 10/3. The heights of members of a ski club are normally distributed. The average height is 64.7 inches with a standard deviation of 4.3 inches. Determine the percent of club members to the nearest percent, so that's whole number, who are between 67 inches and 72 inches. All right, so this is a normal curve problem where, again, the mean is 64.7 and the standard deviation is 4.3. They want to find the probability of selecting somebody between 67 and 72 inches tall. So that's representing this area under our normal distribution curve. Anytime you're finding the area under the curve, you're finding the probability. That means you're doing normal CDF, where it would ask you to type in the mean, the standard deviation, the left bound, which in this case is 67, and the right bound, which is 72. Where's my calculator? Okay, found it. It was not coming up for some reason. All right, so normal CDF is under second VARS, option 2. And I'm just going to type those numbers in. 64.7, 4.3, 67, and 72. Wait, what am I doing? Oh my god, I switched this up. Hold on a second. Damage control. I gotta fix this. So my lower bound, oh, I totally wrote this wrong. I'm gonna have to fix this. All right, so my lower bound is 67. My upper bound is 72. My mean is 64.7. And my standard deviation is 4.3. Sorry about that. My brain was not working in that moment. All right, there we go. We typed it in. I get 0.25, which is 25%. But I do have to fix these numbers here. My bad. So if I come here, this was left bound, right bound, mean, standard deviation. Ultimately, it came out to 0.25 ... which it worked out to 25%. Done. Okay, but I'm showing my calculator work. I got a little picture here. That's my work justifying my answer, and I rounded appropriately. All right, explicit formula, A sub n equals 6 plus 6n represents the number of seats in each row in a movie theater, where n represents the row number. Rewrite this in recursive form. Now, it's always a good idea just to get a gauge of what this even looks like. So if I go to my calculator and type in 6 plus 6x, and I go to my table of values, you guys can see that the first number, the first row would have 12 seats, not 6, so be careful. Then it would be 18, then 24, then 30. So you guys can see that it's going up by 6 because that corresponds to the slope of that line. That's the common difference. So I'm noticing that my first term, like I said, is 12. And if I want the next term, I'm going to take the previous term and add 6 because that's my common difference. And that's your recursive formula. This is something that you guys have to have memorized to do. It is not on the reference sheet, and they love asking about it. All right, next question, express in simplest form. So ultimately, I'm just doing some work with some i's in here. So it might be a good idea to make this a little bit more simple first, because I've actually done this problem before without simplifying the I at first, and I think it made it more complicated. I know that I cubed is negative I, so ultimately this is negative 2xi minus 3y. And I'm just going to write that twice. Pen is not wanting to work right now. Okay, so now I'm just going to FOIL. Now, what I'm noticing here is that these are like terms, so I can combine that to a 12xyi, and I squared is -1. So therefore, this is -4x squared plus 12xyi plus 9y squared. And that's my correct answer. Now, I will say that the first time I did this, I didn't simplify the I cubed at first, and I FOILed it, and then I did the i's. It worked, but the i's obviously got larger, so it took me a little bit longer to simplify. But ultimately, it's fine. But I think this was better. All right, a survey was given to 1,250 randomly selected high school students at the end of their junior year. The survey offered 4 post-graduation options: 2-year college, 4-year college, military, or work. Of the 1,250 responses, 475 chose a 4-year college. State one possible conclusion that can be made about the population of high school juniors based on this survey. So anytime you guys are doing surveys, you're trying to find information that you can apply then to a population. So according to my sample, of my 1,250, 475 said that they were going to a 4-year college, which this works out to be 0.38 or 38%. So according to my sample, what that means is about 38%, or I can inference that about 38% of my high school juniors plan to attend a 4-year college. My handwriting is not great right now, but it's fine. Okay. Question 33. A researcher wants to determine if nut allergies and milk allergies are related to each other. The researcher surveyed 1,500 people and asked them if they are allergic to nuts or milk. The survey results are summarized in the table below. So it's going to want me to determine the probability of people that are allergic to milk, and probability randomly selected survey is allergic to milk given the person is allergic to nuts. And then it looks like it goes on to ask if they are independent events. Okay, so first thing I would do is figure out my totals here. So just adding stuff up in the margins. And everything adds to 1,500 as it should here. So probability that a student is allergic to milk. So I'll just have milk, not milk, nuts, not nuts. Probability of being allergic to milk is 45 out of 1,500. Doesn't have any sort of rounding directions, so I can just leave it like that. Now next, allergic to milk given they're allergic to nuts. Okay, so we don't care about anybody else in the table. We're just looking at those that are allergic to nuts. So in our study, that's 15 people. Of those 15, 3 are also allergic to milk. So probability of milk given nuts was 3 out of 15. Okay, cool. Based on your survey, determine whether nut allergies and milk allergies are independent. Well, guess what, guys? You just computed it. Probability of milk is 45 out of 1,500, which is 0.03. Probability of milk given being allergic to nuts is 0.2 if I do that division. Those are not equal. And that is how you assess independence. So since they are not equal, they are not independent. That means that being allergic to nuts has some sort of impact on being allergic to milk. So there is a factor going on there. There is a connection. But when it says justify your answer, that's just showing your work. And, oh, hey, look at that. I did it. All right, question 4 is a radical equation problem, and they ask me to algebraically solve. So I'm always looking to isolate my radical first. So I'm going to go ahead and subtract the 6 and divide by 2. So if I divide by 2, that's x minus 3 equals radical x minus 1. And now I can square both sides. Left-hand side, I just did a quick little FOIL. And now I'm setting it equal to 0 to solve. I'm factoring roots. Now, right here is where a lot of students will stop and they will say, all right, cool, like that's my answers. But you have to check because you could have extraneous solutions. So a way that you guys can do this is utilizing some technology. I could take 5 and store him as x. 5 stow x. Okay, cool. So every time I type in x, he's going to represent a 5. So I can type in the left side of my equation, which is 2x. That gives me 10. And then I'm going to do the right side of my equation. So 6 plus 2 square root x minus 1. That also gives me 10. So that tells me that x equals 5 is a solution. Now I'm going to do the same thing, but with now 2. So I'm going to do 2 stores x. So I actually can go up and grab this 2x, although that was kind of silly because that was easy to retype. So the left side of my equation would give me a 4. But what would the right side of my equation give me? An 8. And we know 4 is not equal to 8. So therefore, that's an extraneous solution. I have to reject it. Therefore, x equals 5. So make sure you always check your solutions. Alright guys, 52 minutes, and I am almost done. I knew this would be a task, but hey, we're doing it, right? Alright, question 35. During the summer, Adam saved $4,000 and Betty saved $3,500. Adam deposited his money in Bank A at an annual interest rate of 2.4% compounded monthly. Betty deposited her money in the Bank B at an annual interest rate of 4% compounded quarterly. Write 2 functions that represent the value of each account after T years if no other deposits or withdrawals are made, where Adam's account value is represented by A of T and Betty's is B of T. So this is the formula you guys should be thinking of. Notice how they did not give it to you. Something you're gonna just have to have memorized. So with that being said, Adam had $4,000 and his interest rate as a decimal is 0.024 and it was compounded monthly. So we're going to do a 12T. Okay, then there's Betty. Uh-oh, where'd she go? There it goes. Betty was 3,500. 0.04 divided by 4 because she was compounded quarterly. Alright, that's it. That's the first part. So knowing my formula and plugging in the values accordingly. Using technology, so that's your calculator, determine to the nearest tenth of a year how long it will take the 2 accounts to have the same amount of money and justify your answer. So ultimately, I'm just taking my 2 functions. I'm going to call them y1 and y2. And I'm just going to find the intersection in the graphing calculator. So I'm going to pause this, type in. Alright, so just catching you up to speed here, I typed them both in. And a standard window is not going to be good for this, but what I can tell you is I know my initial value is at like 4,000. So, and I know it's going up. So I chose for my window a Y max of 10,000 and it seemed to work pretty well for me. So from there, there's my 2 functions. I'm doing second trace intersect, first curve, second curve, guess. And there it jumps to 8.43 and 48.96 and change. And that is my graphic work to support my answer. So what I would do is a nice little sketch. So there's my x-axis, there's my y-axis, which again, I used 10,000 as my maximum. Ultimately, 10 did work for me. I got it to fit. Here's one function. There was another. And they intersected right there at 8.43 dot 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 4896.89 dot dot dot. Because again, I'm justifying my answer. So I'm going to my calculator. This is my calculator work. Now, ultimately, they wanted how much to the nearest tenth of a year. So that's our time. So the correct answer is 8.4 years. All right, question 36. On the graph below, draw at least one complete cycle of a sine graph passing through the point 0, 2 with an amplitude of 3, period of pi, and a midline at y equals 2. Now, something to note is that they actually set the x-axis for you, which can be kind of nice, even though it's a little bit different than what I typically do. But for a period of pi, it actually will work out pretty nicely. As far as the y-axis goes, I'm just going to keep one box equal to 1. So first, I'm going to put in my midline of y equals 2, and I'm going to label him. Now, from there, they also said you had to go through the point 0, 2. Now, that actually makes sense because that is starting on the midline, which is what a sine graph does. Now, if the period is pi, that's how long it takes to see that cycle. So if we start on the midline, we're going to end on the midline. Halfway in between, we're on the midline again. Now, from there, it didn't say whether we would go up or down first, so ultimately it's up to you, but I would probably just go up first for my sine graph. So here, and it has an amplitude of 3, so 1, 2, 3. Here, 1, 2, 3. Amplitude is our distance from our midline. And that is one cycle. Oops. Let me do that again. That is one cycle of sine. Said draw at least one. I did it. So based on your graph, state an interval where the graph is increasing. So here's an interval right there, that little chunk right there based on my one cycle of sine. So if this is 0 and this is pi over 2, which is the same thing as 1/2, this must be pi over 4. So the interval of increase, I'm going to say, is 0 to pi over 4. Technically, you could say 3 pi over 4 to pi based on that little chunk right there, but I just went with the simplest one, the first one I saw. All right, we're on to the very last question, the 6-point question here. A manufacturer of sweatshirts finds the profits and costs fluctuate depending on the number of products created. Creating more products doesn't always increase profits because it requires additional costs, such as building a larger facility or hiring more workers. The manufacturer determines the profit P of X in thousands of dollars as a function of the number of sweatshirts sold, X in thousands. This function is given below. So the first thing they want you to do is graph on the interval of 0 to 9 on the axes below. Now, what's kind of nice about this problem is they actually set the scale for you so that you don't have to think about a scale that would make sense. It's also kind of giving you a gauge of where they want you to look in the calculator, especially when they say to graph from 0 to 9. So, I'm going to zoom in here. They have 1 box equals 1 on the x-axis, so I'm just going to label a few more places. I'm going to stop there because remember they want me just to go to 9. And I'll mark off a few more places. Just going by every 2 boxes is 30, according to the scale that they set for me. Okay, so from there, guys, ultimately, you're just typing this in the calculator and getting a table of values. So I'm just going to show you guys what that would look like. And boom. So that's my table of values. Now I'm going to plot some points. And there. Honestly, that was kind of challenging for me to do on my computer here with my stylus, but that's ultimately the shape of it. I'm sure you would do a better job than me with a pen and pencil, actually. So pencil you can use for your graph here on your exam, by the way. Okay, so that's the general shape of it. Okay, make sure you take some care. It should be a nice smooth curve through those coordinate points. Over the given interval, state the coordinate of the maximum of P and round all values to the nearest integer. Explain what this point represents in terms of the number of sweatshirts sold and profit. So ultimately, they want you to use technology to find the maximum, which should be around 778. So I'm going to grab my calculator. All right, so I typed it in and adjusted my window to be according to what I have graphed here. So my Y minimum was -90, my max is 120, so that this is kind of like roughly matching what I have over here. Because remember, we only graphed from 0 to 9. I'm finding this maximum. So second, trace maximum, which is option 4. And I can just type in my bounds. I know it's somewhere in quadrant 1, so I can type in x equals 0. I can type in x equals 10. And hit enter again, and there you are at, oh hey, look at that, to the nearest integer. It actually rounds to 7 and 78. So ultimately that is our maximum. Now I have to explain what this means in the context of the problem. So in this, remember that X is our number of sweatshirts sold, but it's in thousands. Likewise, 78 is also in thousands according to how it was defined. So, in order to make the most profit, 7,000 sweatshirts must be sold to make $78,000. This is kind of funny. I don't know what happened to the rest of my question here, but I can tell you what I know the rest of it is. I'll have to double check how this copied. It says, determine how many sweatshirts to the nearest whole sweatshirt the manufacturer would need to produce a positive profit. And it says, justify your answer. That's funny. I don't know what happened to the rest of my question there. I'll have to double check that. Okay, so anyway, to initially make a positive profit means when you look at your graph, anything above the x-axis here is technically a positive profit because it's positive there. That's where your y values are positive. So I'm thinking what I need to do is find this because that's where our profit is technically 0, because then anything to the right of that would be positive profit. So let's find that intersection point. So if I go to my calculator, I can do second trace 0, because that's crossing the x-axis. I just need to get to the left of it, get to the right of it, and we're at 3.54883 and 0. So I'm going to label that. So, to the nearest whole sweatshirt, again, remember this is in thousands. If I take that number and multiply by 1,000, 1, 2, 3, that's where my new decimal place would go. So this would be 3548.8 ... or 3549 to the nearest whole sweatshirt. That means in order to make the first positive profit, they would need to sell 3549 sweatshirts. And that's the answer to that question, to have the first positive profit. All right, now this question says to justify your answer, and ultimately that's what I am doing here using my calculator. I was just determining where p of x equaled 0, and then I just interpreted that coordinate point. All right, guys, an hour and 5 minutes dedicated to this video. I've never done this before. I had no idea how long it would take me to get through this exam, but I did it. We did it. I hope this helped. Good luck studying.